Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi and the Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask a lot of questions today. My guest is Miko Peled. If you don't know who he is, he's an author and an activist in the Middle East, Palestine specifically, and he's a former Israeli officer, and I'm going to let him get into his story, but he is the author of The General's Son, and he's also the author of Injustice, the story of the Holy Land 5, which has come out this year, I believe, and he's with us right now. Miko, are you there?
I am.
Hey, Miko, thank you so much. I know you're getting ready to travel back to Palestine yourself, and so I know that trying to just go on a simple vacation, much less be gone for 2 weeks, is a lot, so I appreciate you taking the time. Really quick, so you can... Oh, sorry, sir?
Palestine, I was saying Palestine is not a vacation. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
I was going to say, if just kind of jumping into it, if we could, just spend a couple of minutes going into your background a little bit. How you came to where you're at now, and your background, coming into the state of Israel in 47, 48 with your grandfather and your father, and kind of getting from there.
Well, like the title of my book suggests, my father was a general in the Israeli army, so the book is called The General's Son. And the subtitle is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, because at a certain point in my life, I embarked on a journey to discover that there's a place called Palestine, and I live in it, and I didn't even know. So this was an interesting discovery for me. I come from a very patriotic Israeli Zionist family. Every member of my family, my grandparents, were all involved in the establishment of the State of Israel. One of my grandfathers is signed on the Israeli Declaration of Independence. So, I mean, that was kind of my upbringing. But the journey into Palestine forced me to think about, well, what is this thing, Palestine, and what is Israel, and who am I? And basically, it was a journey from the sphere of the privileged into the sphere of the oppressed. That's, if you want to simplify it, that's exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. So the sphere of the privileged, where the roads are paved and everything is clean and water's running and the electricity is flowing and there's no problem and it's safe and clean and wonderful, to the sphere of the other, in this case the Palestinians, mm-hmm. where there's potholes and there's no water and there's no electricity regularly, and the life is completely different, not only in terms of their access to resources and their access to the things we take for granted, like running water and electricity, but the rights. In other words, the rights, the laws under which they live are entirely different than the laws under which I grew up and I live. And I only live 5 minutes. I grew up in Jerusalem, and so we're 5 minutes away from each other. Two communities are very close.
Right.
And it really doesn't matter. I mean, other places, two communities are very close to us. And that kind of drove me to realize that what had been done to the Palestinians from the very beginning was a crime, that the establishment of the State of Israel was a crime, that the ideology that founded the State of Israel, which is Zionism, is a racist, settler colonial, violent ideology. To the point where today I reject the State of Israel, I reject Zionism, and I believe that we should all strive for a real democracy with equal rights in a free Palestine.
How do you? Are you still? I know by heritage you're Jewish, but are you practicing? Are you religious?
Well, it's not about Jewish or not Jewish. I'm Israeli. That's the issue. I was born Jewish. I don't practice. But the thing is, I'm an Israeli citizen. That's the key issue here.
Sure. And the reason I ask
have an
is
Israeli citizenship.
Right. Well,
my privilege comes from my being an Israeli citizen.
Absolutely. I mean, my question just kind of stems from the fact that one of the core tenets of Zionism is the Exodus, and a lot of most Jews I know that are even atheists will say, well, the Exodus, and that's why it's our right, and the other argument that I hear a lot is, well, Palestine was never a country. It's always been a territory, and that the Israeli Arabs are getting it better than they would anywhere else in the Middle East. If they go to Dubai, or if they go to the Emirates, they have no rights, and they have more rights in Israel than they do in the rest of the Middle East. I mean, is that something how do you counter that when you hear that?
Well, I don't bother countering that because none of it makes sense. There were no countries anywhere at some point. I mean, America wasn't a country. No countries were countries up to a certain point when countries were created. So that doesn't mean anything.
Sure. Okay.
Israel wasn't a country. It wasn't a state until it was established. Syria. I mean, that's not really an argument. The reality today is that there is a state of Israel. It's a racist state. It's founded on racism. In fact, they just passed a few days ago a basic law, which is kind of like the Constitution, it's like a constitutional amendment, which basically, in a word, officializes Israel as an apartheid regime for Jews only.
Mm-hmm.
2 million people in Gaza live without water or electricity or basic rights or the ability to travel or move or live. They're being bombed regularly. 5 million refugees living in refugee camps in squalor. And all of this because the state of Israel decided, the Zionists decided, or a group of Jews decided, that they're going to come and create a Jewish state in an Arab country. And so the Palestinians are the victims of this. And since then, it's basically been a campaign that includes genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the establishment of a racist apartheid regime in Palestine. So none of this, in my view, could be legitimized with any claim.
Okay.
Nothing can legitimize or justify or excuse that.
No, I agree with. I agree with that. The argument that it was our land first. I'm like 3,000 years ago. I mean, we're not giving the land back to the Indians, and they had it longer than we did when we came here. And something you made a point of the other day when we were talking that I really appreciated. That I want to ask you a question about. You made the comment that what you would like to see is not have happened to the Palestinians what did happen to the American Indian, where they become so marginalized and all they got at this point is casinos and whiskey.
Well, the point is this: if America is the standard, then racism, violence is the standard because America was founded on racism and violence.
Right.
The genocide of the natives, of the indigenous people, the enslavement of blacks. Dropping nuclear bombs, destroying Southeast Asia. I mean, that's what America is. So America stands for racism and violence. And if that's the standard, then yes, Israel. You can see that there are some shared values between Israel and the United States: racism and violence,
right.
Destruction, racism, genocide, and really apartheid, which America has been for a very long time, an apartheid state.
So
getting away with it.
So this new vote in the Knesset, and it was a pretty close vote. When I read about it, it was I think
55-62.
Okay, yeah, it was
62 with 2 abstentions.
It wasn't overwhelming. So obviously there was some debate and there was some back and forth. And you made an interesting comment to me the other day when I used the term Arab Israeli, which I never thought of as being anything other than just a term, but you made a really interesting point to me when you said that was a degrading term given to Palestinians such that you don't have to acknowledge any sort of right or statehood or a nationality. Does this new vote give permission now for those people in Israel? I'm not even talking about the territories now. I'm just talking about the citizens that are in Israel. Does this vote give them give the government permission now to do more sanctioning apartheid behavior? Well,
the very first laws that were ever passed when the State of Israel was established in 1948 defined pretty much Israel as a racist law as a result of several laws that were passed: citizenship law, land ownership law, the right of Jews to return, and the denial of Palestinian refugees to return, and so forth. Then over the past 7 decades, Israel passed dozens of laws that give preferential treatment to Jews. And so they don't always say that we are denying the Palestinians this, but we are giving preferential treatments to Jews because this, that, and the other. And then there was there's just a very basic atmosphere of racism and many policies that were not really laws but policies. Now some of these laws were challenged in court. Some of these laws, land confiscation, land laws, and things like that, they tried to challenge in court. Very little success. Now these laws have become constitutional. In other words, it's a basic law, which is like Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it has a set of basic laws that define the state, and this has become the newest basic law.
Mm-hmm.
And it says that Jews have a unique right for self-determination in this country. They say that the state will now encourage and, as a policy, build Jewish-only settlements. They've done it anyway, but now they can deny Palestinians. They've been denying Palestinians to live within Jewish communities in many ways, but now it's constitutional.
Mm-hmm.
They've defined Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, which is,
right.
They've treated it that way anyway. But Jerusalem, of course, according to international law, should not be in the sovereignty of any state.
Right.
and Israel violated that in 1948. Took Western Jerusalem and completely emptied it of all Palestinians. The ethnic cleansing campaign of the western part of Jerusalem was 100% successful. Not a single Palestinian, not a single Palestinian family was left in West Jerusalem, which is the part of Jerusalem where I was born and raised.
Okay.
Now the same thing is being done in East Jerusalem. So, I mean, all of these things that have been done anyway are now constitutional. They are definers of the state of Israel.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, and then, and you mentioned earlier how there was no real country there. I mean, the Sykes-Picot Agreement obviously, created artificial borders where there were no lands before, and much to the chagrin of the Arabs who actually fought the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. But yet now, moving into today, for example, you just mentioned how Donald Trump unilaterally made Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and now they're all excited. They got a new embassy, blah blah blah. But with the one thing with all the protests and the demonstrations and the deaths, at the Gaza fence, I didn't see anyone else in the Middle East raising a stink about it. Is there more of a complicit behavior toward pretending the Palestinians don't exist and pretending the problem is not the Middle East's anymore? Because up until Nasser, they used to kind of care, even though the first 20 years of Israel, they sort of left the West Bank alone. They didn't really give the Palestinians any real help or aid. It was just sort of, well, hopefully it doesn't. And then the 6-Day War came, and then the Arabs got mad at Israel for taking what they took. But it just doesn't seem like the rest of the Middle East. It seems I guess the word I'm looking for is complicit. It seems like they're more complicit in the behavior and allowing Israel. It seems like they're more allies than they're not. Is that inaccurate to think?
Well, there's several issues here. I mean, when on the Jerusalem issue, both the Arab states and the Muslim states convened, and the United Nations convened, and they all expressed their dissatisfaction very, very clearly. So the entire world stood against this and did what civilized people do. They convene, they have votes, and then they demand a change. The problem is none of them have teeth. Mm-hmm. None of these resolutions have teeth, so they're not really enforceable.
Right.
Now, the reality in the countries that surround Palestine, and I call the country Palestine because I think calling it Israel only legitimizes the crimes and the genocide. So I refuse to legitimize it and call it Israel. So the countries that surround Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, and so forth, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, they're all governed by governments that have no legitimacy. These are governments that are propped up by America, supported by Israel, both in weapons and in money, and they do not represent the voice of the people. And so their policies are the policies of individual corrupt leaders that have nothing to do with the will of the people and nothing to do with the will of anybody but their own selfish interests. So it's hard to blame the Arab countries because they have governments that don't represent them, and so that's the reality. And the countries that did stand up for Palestine, there was a list of countries called the Refusal Front back in the day, and I'll give you the list of the countries and see what happened to them. That was Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and Syria.
Oh wow! What a coincidence! What
a coincidence! And then the other countries, which are governed by corrupt, megalomaniac, fascist, monarchs. Look at them, or generals, like in the case of Egypt, Gulf, the Saudis, Jordan, and Morocco, and so forth. So I mean, there's a reality here. Israel did a very good job, or the Israeli government, the Zionist movement, did a very good job in establishing very strong connections and a lot of support with corruptible leaders in the states that surrounded Palestine. This is even before they established the state, the Zionist state, the state of Israel. So they've been doing a lot of work, and of course, America supports Israel 110%. And so everybody's working on the same page here, and the voices of the Arab people are not heard because they have no representation, because they live under vicious dictatorships.
And how do you feel about the current Palestinian leadership? I mean, and I was going to ask you a short question. It's such a long time ago now, but how did you feel about Yitzhak Rabin? Did you feel that the Oslo Accords were real progress, or was that just a gimme, throw me a bone kind of a thing? How did you feel about Rabin?
Well, originally I thought it was a good thing, but then I woke up like everybody else and realized, look, Yitzhak Rabin was a war criminal. There's no way that he was going to make peace with Palestinians. And there was no way that he was going to allow the Palestinians anything. The whole Oslo Accord was surrender by the Palestinians in return for a few symbols of state, like a president and and ambassadors. I mean, things that are absolutely meaningless. There is no Palestinian state.
Right.
There are no Palestinian. You know what I mean? So I mean, the whole Oslo Accord was really surrender. It was an attempt. And people say the Oslo Accord failed. They didn't fail. They were an astounding success, because the reality in Palestine today, where Israel controls all the resources, all the people, and Palestinians have absolutely nothing, is a direct result of the Oslo Accord. The Oslo Accord allowed this to happen. And they don't mind if the Palestinians collect their own trash and have a little authority that has no authority.
Right.
So when we talk about Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority is not Palestinian leadership. People always refer to Hamas and Fatah. Well, Hamas and Fatah are two groups out of many, and they haven't been able to have elections in a very long time. The real Palestinian leadership exists on the ground, in the grassroots movement, within the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Lots of coalitions on the ground that do incredible work, the popular resistance, and then local leaders within the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens who are trying to fight within the framework of the state. Of course, now we know that there's no point in fighting that anymore because of this new law. And so that is the Palestinian leadership. The Palestinian leadership are people that are mostly unknown, and thousands of Palestinian leaders who are sitting in Israeli jails and have been sitting in Israeli jails for a very long time. And of course, there are the many that were assassinated by Israel over the years.
Sure. Well,
so that's what the real Palestinian leadership is. The PA is not Palestinian leadership.
Well, that was my next point, which is really, I was going to ask it as a question, but Mahmoud Abbas just seems like a toothless opportunist who's got a.
Well, nobody voted for him. Nobody ever elected him.
Right. He was he succeeded without any, and now at this point he's building a $13 million palace, and he's got his own plane, and meanwhile the people are still struggling and suffering, and land is getting lost by the day. There doesn't seem to be any attempt to even come, at least from the PA, to lead or combat the government of Israel in the settlements, for example. Which, how do you tell me you're serious about peace? You know, the joke I used to make my friends all the time is, I could solve peace in the Middle East in 10 minutes. You stop lobbing bombs into Israel, and the Israelis quit building settlements. Done. The settlements tell you that you're not serious. The settlements tell everybody that you're not serious about a peace process. Two-state solution is a dead issue. I was going to ask you a little bit about that.
Well, I'll say one thing. The most of the lobbing of bombs was done by Israel into Palestinians and not the other way around. So Israel will have to stop dropping bombs and have to stop building settlements, because the two go hand in hand. But Israel is not interested, never was interested, never will be interested in peace with the Palestinians, because the very existence of the State of Israel is in opposition to the idea of peace with the people of Palestine. Because you can either have a people of Palestine have their rights, or the State of Israel. The Zionist ideology claims that the entire land belongs to the Jews. The entire land is the entire land, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. There is no other Israel. There is no Israel that is not over that entire thing. You know, what used to be the West Bank is Judea and Samaria. There's no West Bank. There's no such thing as the West Bank.
Okay.
And so this is a reality that we have to come to terms with. And the idea of peace with Israel is an oxymoron. It's an impossibility. It's an absolute impossibility. The objective of the Zionist movement and of the State of Israel from day one was to conquer the entire land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, get rid of the Arabs, and build a state for Jews. They've done that. And the problem is that these Palestinians are not going away. So in some places they kill them, in some places they kick them out, in some places they starve them, and in some places they let them die of thirst.
Well, isn't it?
This is the process.
Well, isn't it true also that when the State of Israel was becoming formed and was, the partition in 1947 and everything else, wasn't it true that initially the discussions, probably as early as the 20s from what I can recall reading, that they were actually talking about taking Jordan as well, or was that just misinformation?
Well, there was a group within the Zionist movement that said that both sides, because Palestine used to be both sides of the Jordan River. And then Winston Churchill, when he was a cabinet member, he was in charge of the colonies, I think. He just drew a line and said, no, we're going to separate them. This is going to be Palestine, and this is the other side, the east side is going to be something else. So there were some groups, a minority within the Zionist movement that said, well, that's all the land of Israel, so we want it all. But that died very fast.
Mm-hmm.
That was short-lived, and nobody ever took it seriously. The Zionist movement wanted from the river to the sea, and they got it, and that's it, and it's a done deal. There's no going back. There's no two-state. There's no possibility. There never has been any serious discussion on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, there was, but on the Israeli side, there's never been any serious discussion of allowing the Palestinians to establish their own state, and they've done everything they possibly could to make sure that possibility did not exist, and they succeeded. There is no possibility for a Palestinian state separate from all of Palestine.
Well, and then
it's not all of Palestine.
And then, and I don't want to go through all 9 of them. I'm aware that because their argument here all the time is that the Palestinians turned down 9 land for peace deals. The PLO turned down 9 land for peace deals. What types of land for peace deals were these?
It's a lie. It's an absolute lie.
Okay, and like a couple.
It doesn't even deserve a response. It's an absolute lie. The Palestinians from the mid-1970s, and then officially from 1988, the Palestinian national movement was ready to make peace based on the two-state solution, as long as the entire West Bank, with East Jerusalem and the entire Gaza Strip, become a Palestinian state. There was never, not even once, not even for a minute, anybody on the Israeli side that was willing to do that.
So even
interested in doing that, or was going to allow to do that. So it never happened.
So even 90 days.
Call this claim that it's a complete lie.
Okay.
There's absolutely no truth to it whatsoever.
Okay. So, and this is just me, American kid, half Arab. I know what I know. So the big one that I always heard was 90 days after the 6-Day War, the PLO was offered the West Bank in its entirety just to recognize Israel's state right to exist. Is that not true?
That's an absolute lie. Let me tell you what happened.
Okay.
On the 5th day of the 6-Day War, on the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, they've already won the war. It was the glorious day. It was the moment of glory. These generals, and my father was among them. He was a member of that.
Miko Peled, right?
That, right.
Mm-hmm.
He stood up and he said, in that very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, he stood up and he said, "We now have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians based on the two-state solution, but not the original two-state solution of the partition plan, on a two-state solution that will be favorable to us." In other words, a very small Palestinian state on just the West Bank and Gaza,
right,
which is barely 20% of Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, and when people said, no, the Palestinians will never agree, he went in, still in uniform, and brought intelligence that proved that the Palestinian leadership was willing to accept that. And eventually he was taken off to the side and he was told, "What, are you out of your mind? We just finished the job. We just took the rest of the land of Israel that we should have taken in 1948. What are you talking about? Who even cares about these people? Why would we want to give them any of this land? We just took it and it's ours." And immediately as these things were happening, like the war was barely over, the smoke was still coming out of the barrels, the gun barrels, Israeli bulldozers were destroying entire cities, entire neighborhoods, entire villages, and building Jewish settlements massively in the West Bank. So the claim that the Palestinians said no to a peace offer is complete nonsense, because my dad stood there, and it's on record, and it's in my book, and it's in the Israeli Army Archive, which is where I found the transcripts of these meetings.
Wow. Okay.
And nobody was interested. And Golda Meir, who was shortly after that became prime minister,
right,
one day took a look and said, "What happened to Miko Peled? Why is he talking like this? This is nonsense." The Israeli government they took the West Bank in order to keep the West Bank. They didn't take the West Bank as a result of spoils of war or as a result of some war that happened to happen. It was a planned conquest. They had planned for it for more than 10 years.
So unlike the Sinai...
And in fact,
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying it's not like it just happened. This was a planned conquest, and they just waited for the right moment. The right moment came, they took it, and they started building immediately. They kicked out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. They completely changed the nature of Jerusalem, and they completely turned the West Bank into what it is today, which is Judea and Samaria, part of the state of Israel.
Right, and then that was my next question. So, when, they took the Golan Heights, they took the Sinai Peninsula. Those were. Did they plan to use those as bartering chips later, or why was that later on? part of a negotiation where the West Bank and obviously the Gaza Strip was kind of obviously not part of the equation?
Well, there are several issues. The Golan Heights, Israel wanted for a very long time, and Israel had initiated armed clashes with the Syrians in order to take the Golan Heights, going back as the late 50s, early 60s. So taking the Golan Heights is something they absolutely planned to do, and they took it because they wanted the water and they wanted the land and so forth. And then they had no intention of returning the Sinai Peninsula either. However, when President Jimmy Carter got Anwar Sadat and begging together, and for about $3.5 billion a year in foreign aid,
right,
Israel said, fine, you know what, let them have the Sinai Peninsula. And they made sure that they always have a regime in Egypt that is favorable to Israel.
Right.
And then everybody felt like Israel wanted peace. But the next, pretty much immediately after that peace was signed, Israel invaded Lebanon and stayed in Lebanon, occupied southern Lebanon for 10 years. So I mean, this is an opportunity that no Israeli prime minister could say no to. He gave up a bunch of the Sinai Peninsula, but he got $3.5 billion a year in foreign aid.
Right.
Which, of course, Israel doesn't need.
Which was matched to
that was the exchange.
Yeah, which was matched to Egypt. I mean, Egypt has been paid to be good boys and good girls for the last 35, 40 years.
It wasn't matched. Egypt got about half.
About half.
Egypt
okay.
gets about half of that.
Okay, and which at that time for them and still now is given the economy a lot of money. So they're basically paid to be silent. They're paid to be, that was always the impression I got from that deal was that. So I mean, so the idea.
Well, the biggest Arab country recognized and made peace with Israel. The biggest, most important Arab country made peace and gave up and basically threw the Palestinians under the bus. That's what that was.
Yeah, no, I remember my father was really angry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
When I was a kid, I didn't understand it and even when I was in college, when I was like 15, I kind of got it and I didn't. And then I got into college, thinking I was getting all smart and still didn't understand why he thought Sadat was making peace on behalf of the Palestinians, which I used to maintain he didn't. And then I got into my 30s and I realized, yeah, he kind of did. He kind of threw them under the bus because that meant he was never going to, no Egyptian leader was going to come to the table on behalf of the Palestinians and try to negotiate as the bigger power. Yeah. And as a result, they're complicit in the same way that the dictators and the monarchs that you mentioned are complicit. The Saudis and
of course.
And the Emirates and everything.
They were the first ones.
Yeah. So the other thing I was going to ask you, now, obviously, the two-state solution is dead. I mean, it's the West Bank itself has been so whittled away with settlements. I think it's not even 15% of what it was 30 years ago. I mean, there's that border, that 67 border that you always see on the map of the West Bank versus Israel. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Yeah.
No.
So, is there? And so, I guess it's a simpler question. I'll ask this first, and then I'll follow up. But in 2005, what was the motivation of Israel to get settlers out of Gaza? It took like 3 days. And so what was the motivation there, and why are they still turning this place into an open-air prison, even though they voted for Hamas, and they don't like Hamas, although they created Hamas? Why? What was the motivation to get the settlers out in the first place? What bug went up their ass to do that?
Well, let's take a little step back a little bit, okay? The Gaza Strip was created. Gaza Strip has no natural boundaries. There's no strip. There's no such thing as a Gaza Strip, really, geographically or naturally, right? Israel created the Gaza Strip in the early 1950s as a place in which to herd the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees that they kicked out of the southern part of Palestine. They needed a place to go, so they pushed them all to the Gaza Strip. Refugee camps were built along the cities around the city of Gaza. A line was drawn, and that was the Gaza Strip. And almost immediately, after the Gaza Strip was created, Israel began attacking and bombing and murdering Palestinians in Gaza. This happened in the early 1950s. And originally the claim was, well, they're infiltrators. They're trying to come in and infiltrate. Now, these infiltrators were Palestinian refugees who just lost their homes and their land, and they were starving. And they were trying to go back to their land and try to go back to their homes to bring food. And in some instances, these were cases where the Palestinian fighters were trying to go in and try to fight their way back. So these were infiltrators. They were shot on site, And then every time one was caught, Israeli commandos would go in there and commit massive massacres, particularly in the refugee camps. This went on in the 50s. Then later on, they stopped calling them infiltrators. They just started calling them fedayeen, which are fighters.
Right.
Fedayeen.
Right.
We never knew what these fedayeen were, but they're probably very mean. And
Right.
Then they started calling them terrorists. From 1967, the Gaza Strip was under Israeli control completely. In other words, it occupied back the Gaza Strip again. Then they called them terrorists. And again, they would go in periodically and commit terrible massacres. Hundreds, dozens would be killed, on and on and on, because the Palestinians in Gaza were resisting, as they have every right to do. Now they bomb Gaza. Of course, the technology has improved, so they can do a lot more. And they say that the problem is this new creature called Hamas. So Hamas is this new devil that lives in Gaza, which justifies Israel going in there and bombing and massacring every so often on a regular basis, killing civilians and killing nurses and destroying hospitals and so on and so forth by the thousands, because there's this thing called Hamas. Now, in 2005, Ariel Sharon, who was the master butcher, who had probably more blood on his hands than anyone in the Middle East.
Yes.
He decided that he saw that these settlers who were living within the Gaza Strip were pain. They were a problem. They cost a ton of money because they needed protection, because they were stealing the land and they were stealing the water from the Palestinians. It was impossible to go in and carpet bomb Gaza because you have to watch out, be careful. So he decided he was going to pull them out unilaterally, not as part of the deal, and lock up Gaza. And that's exactly what he did. He yanked out these settlers. Of course, they made it into this big drama as though they're being pulled out of their homes. And,
I remember.
And so on and so forth. It was complete nonsense. These are all people that had homes elsewhere. They were settlers.
They're from Brooklyn. These guys are from Chicago, yeah.
Many of them were. And then some 5,000 or 7,000 of them, I believe. And he locked up Gaza. And from that point on, it's a lot easier to carpet bomb. You don't have to worry. You don't have to send the army there to protect the settlers and so forth. And then they realized also that this could portray them as wanting peace, because they could say, look, we gave them Gaza. But nobody gave anybody anything. They just pulled out the settlers so they could bomb them and control the borders better. That was it. And that's exactly what happened. So the killing and massacring in Gaza is part of a strategy that Israel had for a very long time. Well, since Israel created the Gaza Strip. The claim that somehow killing the people in Gaza, the massacres, but the Gaza, there's never been a tank in Gaza. There's never been a regular army. There's never been a tank, a warplane, nothing. These are people. These are hungry, homeless refugees. Today there are 2 million of them.
Right.
And most of the water there is unfit for human consumption. There's no medical care. There's no access to medicine, never mind food and so forth. So this is the reality. This is the reality in Gaza, and this is why Israel pulled out the settlers, and that's what they continue to do. And they still, they have this magic trick where everybody can see that they're bombing innocent civilians that have never had a military force, and they say, well, it's self-defense because there's this monster called Hamas. They're killing Palestinians. I don't know what it means that they say we attacked Hamas, we kill Hamas. They're killing innocent civilians on a regular basis.
Right, they're not getting the leadership.
And it's not about getting, even if they did get the leadership, it wouldn't matter. I mean, they're killing everyone.
Right.
They're killing everyone. They're assassinating everyone.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's the point. Hamas has absolutely nothing to do with any of this.
So just to clarify for some of our listeners, because every time you hear in the news, it's always the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But the Gaza Strip is not a biblical piece of anything. It doesn't have any significance. It was created for a specific purpose, correct?
Yeah, the West Bank, it was also created by Israel. Somebody sat down and drew. There are no natural boundaries to the West. There was no such thing as the West Bank.
Okay.
When Israel was established, it created some borders in agreement with this new state that was called the Kingdom of Jordan. And Israel decided that was going to be the boundary. So somebody sat with a pen and made a boundary which made absolutely no sense because it cut villages and towns in half. And that's the West Bank. But there was no such thing as the West Bank either. Israel, both these parts of Palestine, Gaza Strip and the West Bank, were drawn artificially by Israel.
Okay, give you perspective. So coming up in junior high and high school in the 70s, world history, we were taught, and I went to Los Angeles Unified, so I apologize. I don't think it's their fault. This is just what we were taught, that the West Bank was the West Bank of Jordan, that it used to belong to Jordan, and that it was the West Bank of Jordan. And you're saying that is completely not true.
Well, it's the West Bank of the Jordan River.
Right.
But all of Palestine today is west of the Jordan River.
Right.
When Israel created this area, that was a part at that time. Israel had, when the state of Israel was established, there was also another state established on the other side of the Jordan River called the Kingdom of Jordan. And they brought a prince from the Arabian desert called Abdullah, and they made him the king of this new thing called Jordan. And that's the Kingdom of Jordan. Now, Israel made a deal with this king, the Zionist movement, before even the state of Israel was established, made deals with this king. And at the end of 1948, they had to decide what the borders were going to be. And they drew this line, Israel drew this line and said, okay, well, this is going to be this part is going to be part of the Kingdom of Jordan. But it was temporary. And 19 years later, in 1967, they took it because they felt it was the part of the land of Israel.
Right. Okay.
But my point is that it's an artificial creation. There is no thing called the West Bank naturally. It's like there is no thing called the Gaza Strip naturally. Right. Israel created these two areas for specific reasons that met Israeli interests. And then they took them 20 years later for, again, issues that had to do with Israeli interests. This has nothing to do with anybody else, really.
Well, okay, so let me present a hypothetical real quick. Obviously, after Sykes-Picot, many borders were drawn. I think the only natural borders that were there, or previous borders that were there, were Iran and Syria and Lebanon, if I'm not mistaken. And then everything else was drawn by the French and the British. If as a compromise, because I want to get into another concept we talked about the other day, if as a compromise, but I know this is, I'm talking into a vacuum because, as you said, there is no interest in this at all. But if in a compromise they were to design a two-state solution, and let's just say, for example, the so-called Palestinian leadership decided to abandon the idea of Jerusalem being a capital of anything and settled for Jericho, and took the 1967 West Bank borders and called that Palestine and just cleared the Arabs out of Gaza. And now Israel has a contiguous, beautiful border with brand new beachfront property. Is that something that that's something they would never consider, even though it sounds reasonable to me? I'm not religious. So to me, Jericho, that's a biblical city. Take it and go do your thing. Get some IMF money. Maybe the Saudis can kick in and create a whole new country and finally be done with all this. Is that something that I'm just screaming into the wind on?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, you're an idiot. Yes, you're an idiot.
No, you're not an idiot. You're trying your best to push a square peg into a round hole. Mm-hmm. Let me make it as absolutely clear as I absolutely can. Now, I say this in my lectures at least 10 times, and in the Q&A, somebody always asks me about this. But that's how it is. I mean, we've been conditioned to believe certain things, and it's incredibly hard to pull it out. Even for Palestinians, they hear it all the time, and they believe some of this stuff.
Yeah, well, my dad's
of the state of Israel, the very existence of the state of Israel is the problem.
Right.
It is why there is no peace in Palestine. The very existence of the state of Israel contradicts the possibility of a peace, because the state of Israel is founded on ideology that says it is all the land of Israel. It belongs to the Jews.
Period.
The Palestinians, which they barely call them Palestinians, they usually call them the Arabs of Israel.
Right.
As though these are just Arabs who happen to be wandering around and we're allowing to stay.
I just saw Blazing Saddles on Sunday, by the way. There's that great scene where Mel Brooks is, dressed up as an Indian, and he's doing the whole Yiddish thing, and he's like, the lost tribes of Israel. Anyway, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So these invaders are just invaders. They have no rights. We have rights. We have the Bible. And for those of us who don't believe in the Bible, then actually what the Zionists did, is they secularized the Bible. They said the Bible is not a book of faith. It's the history book of the Jewish people.
Right.
Then they said the Jewish people, which are really a minority religion that lives all around the world, are a nation, and that Palestine is their homeland. So they established this myth, and then they sold it, and they sold it very well. So they succeeded in that regard. Mm-hmm. But, they come up with all kinds of stories and myths and things, but there will never be a peace between an Israel and any Palestinian entity. Israel has just defined itself for not the first time, but as solidly as it possibly could, and made it clear to the entire world, Arabs are not welcome. Palestinians are not welcome. They will either die by the bullet, they will either die by starvation, they will either die of thirst, or we will kick them out. And the ones that remain will remain under a severely brutal and cruel apartheid regime. That's the option. Now, there is another option, which is similar to what was done in South Africa, where the apartheid regime was thrown out and a democracy took place instead, a pluralistic democracy with equal rights. That is the option for people who want peace, for people who believe in justice, for people who care about human rights, and civil rights, and so forth, have to line up behind the idea of establishing a real democracy with equal rights in Palestine and getting rid of this apartheid regime, which is called the State of Israel.
Now, when you say...
And you do this through peaceful means.
Now, okay, that was my next question. So obviously, I know you believe in peaceful means, but as a for instance, what would you recommend? I mean, call it Israel, Palestine, late for dinner. What would we call the new area? And how many Israelis, and secular Israelis, I should preface, would be okay with and are you calling for a name change of the country?
Look, Palestine was taken over by a brutal regime. It was renamed Israel. I think the first thing to do is to make sure we get rid of this regime and call the country by its name, which is Palestine.
Okay.
Now, these are symbolic things. Of course, they're very, very important, but these are symbolic things. You know, what Israel did, what the Zionists did, is they named the country, they gave it a new name.
Right.
And they gave it a biblical name, and they made it sound like the Jewish people have returned after 2,000 years. You know, they made it they romanticized the whole thing, this brutality. But the reality is that this is Palestine. It should return to be Palestine. And this political system, which is the State of Israel, needs to be removed and replaced by a real democracy with equal rights.
And how do you propose we do that with the United States completely supporting, for 70 years now, or at least 50, the current state as it stands?
Well, there's several ways. First of all, I'd remind you that the United States supported South Africa also until the very last minute. The apartheid regime in South Africa until the very last minute. The United States swore in the early 70s that it would never forsake its most important ally in Southeast Asia, a country that most people don't even know ever existed, called South Vietnam. Right. So just because America supports somebody one day doesn't mean they're going to support them the next day. But the greater issue is here. There is a call by the Palestinians themselves. They have given us a roadmap. They've told us what to do. It's called the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's largely what brought down apartheid in South Africa. It is a call to impose boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the State of Israel until three conditions are met, and they're very reasonable, very simple conditions. Ending the military rule of the territory, or what's called, the military occupation, affording equal rights to Palestinians. In other words, if right now, me as an Israeli citizen, a Jew, and a Palestinian Israeli citizen do not enjoy the same rights, even though we're both citizens. And the third demand is the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and their lands. All remedial, have nothing to do with kicking anybody out, have nothing to do with punishing anybody. These are remedial demands. These are very reasonable demands. There's nothing anti-Semitic, violent, evil about them. That is how we do it. We listen to the Palestinians. The Palestinians told us, the largest coalition ever created of Palestinian civil societies and organizations, came up with this call about 10 years ago. This is what we need to do. Impose boycott on Israeli products and on companies that do business with Israel, and demand sanctions immediately. And now I think sanctions are even more crucial because of what is happening in Gaza. I don't understand how the Sixth Fleet doesn't force Israel to open the siege in Gaza and allow humanitarian aid to go into the people of Gaza. That is an absolute crime.
Right.
That has to happen. Thousands of political prisoners These are very, very simple, very remedial, very reasonable conditions, and there needs to be boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the state of Israel. Israel has to be isolated. Israel has to be kicked out of the World Cup. They have to be kicked out of the Olympics. They have to be boycotted of every cultural event. The Israeli ambassador has to be sent home. There has to be a complete breakdown of that system.
So let me back.
And then we move on, like in South Africa.
Well, let me back up a second because, and I'm from LA. We've talked on the phone before. I got a kind of unique background.
Yeah.
My dad's Palestinian. I kind of came up with all the info, but not a big emotional attachment to the whole thing. I just look at it like kind of like Nicaragua, which may be good or bad. But
okay, we'll fix that.
Yeah. Okay. But then I got a lot of Israeli friends, a lot of Jewish friends, and one of the things we'll go back and forth on, for example, political prisoners. How many of them are actually political prisoners? How many of them are actual attackers?
Almost 100%.
Okay.
Well, then take a look at Israeli data. I mean, there's an excellent book that came out. It's called Threat. It's an anthology. It's articles by different mostly Israeli sociologists and political science people. And
I'm sorry, you broke up. The name of the book is Threat?
Yes.
Okay. Continue, I'm sorry.
And in there it shows very clearly the majority of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli prisons have not been charged with acts of violence. Less than 10% of them have been charged with acts of violence. Now, mind you, this is according to Israeli military standards where the bar is very low. Okay?
Yeah.
So even according to them, these prisoners were not charged with acts of violence. These are political prisoners. Now, on top of that, we have to remember that the Palestinians who do have what they call blood on their hands, the ones who did commit acts of violence, are within their rights and within international law, because international law allows for an armed resistance for people who are occupied and oppressed. International law allows for armed resistance for people who are occupied and oppressed in order to, get rid of the oppressor. Mm-hmm. So even they are within, according to international law, they are fully within their rights to have committed, armed resistance, to be part of armed resistance. So they're all political prisoners. They are all political prisoners. They all need to be let out. They say the Palestinians are one of the most, if not the most, incarcerated people in the world.
Right.
Not because they're criminals. So that's the reply to that.
Well, and then just to kind of give the listeners a little bit of a background as well, you're not speaking from some ivory tower. You didn't go to a mountain and grow a beard down to your navel and chant and come up with these views and come up with these facts and figures. You've actually experienced loss in your family.
Yes, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem, mm-hmm. and so when I talk about the legitimacy of the Palestinian resistance, even the military resistance, I know what this means. I know what kind of a price people pay when they lose someone. At the same time, what you cannot do, none of us, even those of us who have seen the horrific results of the violence, we cannot take it out of context. You cannot take it out of context. And even my sister, who lost her daughter, her 13-year-old daughter, stood up and said, I hold the Israeli government responsible for the death of my daughter, because this is what happens when you occupy and oppress another people. They're going to fight back. Mm-hmm. This is exactly what happens when you do this. So we have no one to blame but the Israeli government and ourselves for maintaining this. And she's been very outspoken, since then. It's been 20 years, over 20 years.
Right.
So we can't ignore this. We can't pretend like there's no context here.
No, absolutely.
And context in these issues is everything.
Absolutely. Well, and then that was the thing too. Is I watch a lot of stuff on not mainstream press, and it just seems, and I know not all citizens think this way, but it just seems that a lot of the citizenry seems to be fine with a right wing conservative regime. It seems like after Rabin got...
Well, they voted for them.
Yeah, they voted. Yeah, well, that's my point. They voted for Netanyahu and Sharon and all those. Oh, yeah. So, and I know that the numbers. I mean, obviously, this latest vote in the Knesset shows that it's not an overwhelming majority. And I know a lot of secular Israelis that think along the lines that we're discussing. And I know a lot of.
Well, secular religious is not the issue here, because the very the most orthodox of Orthodox Jews oppose the state of Israel, and oppose the state of Israel from the very beginning, and always stand in support of the Palestinian rights. So it's not an issue of religion so much, because, like I said, that community, a very ultra-Orthodox community, actually does not support the state of Israel at all. But that's maybe a conversation for another for another time.
Sure. Yeah, we're coming close.
But the reality is, look, Netanyahu won with an enormous majority. I mean, in Israeli terms, he won in a landslide. The vast majority, even of the opposition parties, support most of his policies. I mean, the differences are minute. The difference are really because they want his job. It's not because they have any real ideological differences. The reason they oppose this particular law, again, is not because they believe in Palestinian rights, but most of them thought, except for a small minority, they feel it was a bad PR move on Israel's part. Why pass this law and create a PR problem? It's not because they believe in Palestinian rights. So the vast majority of Israeli society, I hate to say this, I come from that society, is extremely racist. Extremely. And the discourse is extremely racist. But that shouldn't surprise anyone, because it's a state that was founded on racism. Once things change, once there is a democracy, once this regime falls, and there is equality, and the Israeli Jews will see that, their kids can go to school with Palestinian kids, and they can have a Palestinian prime minister, and the sky is not going to fall. They're going to keep going to school and keep going to work, and life goes on. In South Africa, they've got Nelson Mandela as president. That's not so bad.
Right.
So, I mean, that's when things begin to change. That's when the racism begins to change. That's when people's attitudes begin to change. It's not going to change until they're forced to their knees, until Israel is forced to collapse like apartheid regime in South Africa was. And then you see change in people, and people are willing to open their eyes and open their hearts and see that they, first of all, have no choice but to live together. And number two, that it's actually a lot better when we live together, when we work together, when we, and move forward together as a nation.
Well, it's like in war, you can't fraternize with the enemy. If the guy, he's showing you pictures of his kids, then you're less prone to want to execute him. So you can't do.
Exactly.
So when people become friends, I mean, it's like, why do I have all the friends I have in my life? It's because you get to know these people. And really quick, as we're closing, I wanted to ask you a quick question, because we're about the same age, and so. And I'd read up on you, and I'd probably been watching some of your interviews now for probably close to a year. So I was really, really glad when you agreed to come on the show. But you were a Red Beret in the Israeli army. And, I know when I read some of your backstory that, it was a war crime that had led you to question this whole expansionist view. Was it Lebanon in '82? Was that what you saw? Sabra and Shatila?
Well, I'm the generation that was still in mandatory service when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. And we all saw how the government said, this is just going to be a 40-kilometer excursion. It's going to be a short thing. And as the government was saying, this is going to be a 40-kilometer excursion, the Israeli tanks were already in Beirut, which is far beyond 40 kilometers.
Wow.
And then, of course, there was the massacre in Sabra and Shatila and so forth. So that was a real moment for many of us of my generation to realize that you don't believe the government. The government is lying, and then you look back and you realize that they've lied many times before that too. But yeah, that was a defining moment without a doubt for me. Absolutely.
So I know you're leaving tomorrow for a couple of weeks. What's this trip? Is this trip going to be pleasure, or are you going to be doing work?
Well, I have family in Palestine, and Palestine is a fun place. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities to have, to meet great people and do great things. But basically, my work is divided between speaking, writing, and going to Palestine, and creating as much trouble as I can while I'm there with my Palestinian and supporting my Palestinian brothers and sisters who are on the ground struggling and resisting.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Well, Miko, listen, I know you got another appointment here pretty soon, and you got to get out of where you're at. I really appreciate you coming on. Would love to have you come back on at a later date, and fly safe. And sure. I really appreciate the insight and the information that you gave us today. And thank you very much. My guest has been Miko Peled, the author of The General's Son, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Five. Both are incredibly insightful books and stories into what actually happened in some of these situations, especially with the Holy Land Five, which we'll be discussing with Miko next time he comes on the show. Wanted to really get some insight and depth into the General's Son and his current takes on things. Folks, again, you can be a bitter pill on patreon.com/the bitter truth. And if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.